Well, my conversion was rather interesting. Back in 1968, there was a family that lived on the same street, about the same street I lived, in my hometown, Rio de Janeiro. And they were really good friends. And I remember seeing the missionaries, those two guys wearing white shirts and ties, come to visit them once in a while. And I was only 12, but I always thought it was kind of strange. Didn't know what those two young men were. They looked like engineers, or I had no clue what they were. And then one day I remember they came to my door and they said they had a couple of friends they'd like us to meet. So we went upstairs, because I lived on the first floor, they lived on the third floor. So we visited with the missionaries, and they asked if they could come by. I was only 12, and I said, sure. So a week later, they come and knock on our door. My dad was home, the whole family was home, and they introduced themselves. So we sat down and visited for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And then they gave us the very first discussion. And then my dad was impressed. And my dad, for a while, had been going to the Baptist church. He was quite happy with the Baptist church, but he wasn't a very active member. As a matter of fact, I don't think he was ever baptized. And so the missionary left a very good impression. A week later, they came back. They taught us a second discussion. Now this time around, our friend came with them. So it was a very interesting thing, because we felt very comfortable having our friend, our neighbor, with the missionaries. So my dad started to get really interested in what the missionaries had to teach. And another week went by, and they came back with a third discussion. But this time they said, well, we want you guys to come to our church to see what it's like. I'm sure you guys will have a very good impression. So we went to church, and the church, of course, was located about an hour away from where we lived. Bus ride would take at least an hour and 10 minutes. And there was another member that lived nearby. He had this huge car. And I said, I'm sure Brother Gilberto, I think if that's his name, if I'm not mistaken, I'm sure he'll be able to accommodate all of you guys in his car. So there was all 6 of us, Gilberto the driver, and Sister Rosita, this friend that referred the missionaries to us. So we get there, and a huge, absolutely big coincidence happened. The branch president back in those days, his name was Mario Campanella. My dad knew him from back in the early 50s. See, my dad worked for a light bulb factory called GE. And this man, he used to sell shoes. He owned a shoe shop, and he had an idea to go to this factory and offer these shoes to the employees, to all the workers, for a very good price. And he sold a bunch of shoes, even sold shoes to my dad. So my dad knew him, and of course he knew my dad, and they chatted a little bit, and they said, yeah, I'm a branch president, and I'm so happy to see you here. So that left my dad extremely excited about the fact that he knew somebody in the church, and that's pretty much kept us going to church. So another 2 weeks goes by, and the missionaries come to our house, and they give us a baptism challenge. We all accepted a baptism challenge. And I remember back in those days, the church was very small in our hometown. There was only one building, if I remember correctly, just one building. But the church was packed that morning, because a family of 6, which was kind of a news back in those days, was being baptized. And so it was an extremely interesting story, and I'll never forget that day. My mother was extremely touched by the Spirit. She was crying the whole time. My dad was crying, and it was a very uplifting moment. This was back in '68. Back in '75, so 7 years later, I was ready to go on a mission, serve as a full-time missionary for the church. But before going on a mission, I wanted to have the opportunity of going to the temple. So I flew to Washington, D.C. There were no temples back in Brazil. And the missionary, the very same missionary, Elder Dale Roberts, who had baptized us, on May 12th, 1968, was the young man that took us through the temple. He and his wife, Linda, and it was quite a unique experience, extremely touching experience. 2 months later, I was sent to Brazil, back to Brazil, to serve as a full-time missionary in the Porto Alegre mission area. And his companion, for I would say a very happy coincidence, just lives about 30 minutes from where we live now here in Orem, Utah. So it was an extremely interesting experience. And I want you, that's maybe you there or not, if you're not LDS or not a member of the church, pay attention maybe to listen to the words of the missionaries that maybe one day you're running to on the street, or some of those missionaries, they may have the chance of knocking on your door, to listen to their message, just like it did, just like my dad did back on May 12th, and the great impact and change that's caused in our lives. We're extremely happy. We're a very happily family, and I challenge you, if you're not LDS, to, or if you're maybe an active LDS, to return. I know this gospel is true. I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet. He restored the gospel